There is a code you must abide by, not written on paper, not spoken aloud, but written into glances, silences, expectations. You were handed your lines before you had language, taught when to speak, when to shrink, when to nod, when to smile, and when to disappear. Every family has one. Every culture, every system, every dynamic. An unwritten myth you're expected to live inside. And if you don't obey the story, you become the villain in someone else's play. Not because you were cruel, not because you were reckless, but because you stopped performing. You became unpredictable. You violated the silent contract. I will keep pretending if you keep accepting the lie. And once that agreement breaks, so does your safety. Because people don't protect those who betray the illusion. They exile them. Not physically, always, but psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. They begin to narrate you differently. You're no longer good. You're difficult. You're no longer kind. You're selfish, not wise, arrogant, not loyal, dangerous. But it's not really about you. It's about the disruption. Because when you leave the story, you expose that it was never true. And if it's not true for you, maybe it was never true for them either. And that is intolerable. Kierkegaard warned of this in his writings on despair, that the greatest offense is not a crime of violence, but a refusal to live a false self. He called it the sickness unto death, the slow, quiet decay of a person who becomes what the world wants, but never what they are. But what happens when you reverse that sickness? What happens when you reject the mask? You stop being safe. You stop being someone others can predict, mold, or use. And in a world addicted to control, non-compliance is heresy. Because here's the hidden truth no one tells you. It's not just that people prefer the old version of you. It's that they depend on it. Your silence made them comfortable. Your approval made them righteous. Your performance made them feel real. And when you remove those things, they don't feel grateful. They feel exposed. You think you're setting boundaries. They think you're declaring war. Because the moment you stop agreeing with the old story, you become a threat to everyone still living inside it. You are no longer the loyal child, the reliable friend, the agreeable partner. You're the defector, the disruptor, the one who looked behind the curtain and refused to play along. And that's when the story starts to shift, not just around you, but against you. They'll say you've changed, that you're cold now, arrogant, unreasonable, too much, not enough. But all you did was stop being a character they could control, and in systems built on silence, that is the greatest betrayal. So if you've ever felt like the moment you stepped into your truth, the world began rewriting you as a threat, if you've ever been punished for refusing to keep the peace, if you've been called ungrateful, dramatic, confrontational, simply for breaking the script, then stay with me. Because this is not the story of your downfall, it's the story of your return. And it doesn't end in exile, it begins there. This video is not for everyone. It's not for the ones still rehearsing the role. It's not for those who can't bear to question the script, because the applause is still too loud. This is for you if you felt the shift, not just in the room, but in the way people see you, the way their gaze tightens when you speak truth too clearly, the way their affection withdraws the moment you stop performing. This is for the ones who were praised for being so mature until they started telling the truth. For the ones who were the peacemaker, the fixer, the silent glue, until they stopped being silent. And suddenly they were the problem. This is for you, if you've ever felt this. I didn't change. I just stopped agreeing with who you needed me to be. And somehow that was enough to make them turn. Not everyone can handle what happens when you become ungovernable, when your face no longer mirrors what they want to see. Lacan called this the mirror stage gone wrong, when others project an idealized self onto you and require you to reflect it back to sustain their sense of identity. But the moment you fracture that reflection, when you no longer provide them the image of who they believe they are, you're no longer a comfort. You're a crack in their sense of control, a glitch in the fantasy. And most people would rather destroy the mirror than face what it reveals. So they reframe you. This is how it works. You leave the script. They change the genre. Your honesty becomes hostility. Your boundaries become betrayal. Your individuality becomes threat. They will say you're unstable, untrustworthy, delusional. But what they're really saying is, you stopped being easy to control. Because when the story depends on your silence, your truth becomes an act of war. This is not personal. It's structural. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. You're not being punished for who you are. You're being punished for what your defiance represents. Because your defiance isn't just about you. It's a message, a crack in the collective delusion, a signal that escape is possible. And if one person can leave the story, maybe others will too. This is what Nietzsche warned about in the genealogy of morals, the violent moral rebranding of dissenters. To keep the herd intact, those who walk alone must be framed not as free, but as diseased. You see it in families, in institutions, in social movements. The moment someone breaks from groupthink, the smear campaign begins. Not because the group is cruel by nature, but because it's terrified of collapse. Because if the narrative was never true, then what was all this suffering for? So instead of revising the story, they revise you. They rename you, reframe you, cast you out not as a misfit, but as a menace. But the real menace is the truth you refused to bury. And the deeper you go into your own individuation, the more clearly you see the machinery that turns dissent into deviance, not by evidence, but by emotion, by group consensus, by framing, by silence, by whispers that say they're not who they used to be. And no, you're not. You're not the mirror anymore. You're not the echo. You're not the obedient echo chamber they used to rely on. You've become dangerous because you've become real. But the real danger isn't just the smear campaign. It's what comes next. Because when the performance collapses, the system doesn't just exile you. It tightens around everyone still inside. It uses you as an example, as a warning. And this is where it gets darker. You're not just outcast. You're rebranded, weaponized, used to keep others obedient. Because the script isn't enforced by villains. It's enforced by those still trying to survive it. So if you've ever wondered why people stayed silent, why no one stood beside you, why the very people you protected became the ones who turned, stay with me. In the next section, we're going into the machinery, how the story protects itself, and how those still trapped inside are trained to keep you out. The moment you break the script, you become a threat to the people still performing in it. Not because they're evil, not because they hate you, but because they're still trying to survive. In dysfunctional families, rigid friend groups, and even entire institutions, the story becomes more than a story. It becomes order, a closed system that organizes identity, loyalty, and belonging. And when someone exits the system, it destabilizes the whole thing. Your truth doesn't just disrupt them. It threatens the mythology they depend on to function. Because when a system is built on silence, your voice is violence. When a system is built on obedience, your refusal is betrayal. In systems that depend on performance, truth is unforgivable. This is the hidden machinery of collective survival. The system protects itself, not by attacking you directly, but by reinterpreting your truth as a violation. They say you're too sensitive, too intense, making it all about you, because admitting the truth would cause collapse. So instead, they collapse you. Not because the truth isn't valid, but because it's inconvenient. Because it implicates them. To preserve the story, they have to rewrite you. Suddenly, you're the one who changed. You're unstable. You're angry. You need help. This isn't just personal deflection. It's a systemic immune response. Like white blood cells swarming what looks like a threat, the system attacks anything that doesn't fit its design. And if you've ever wondered why entire groups turn against you at once, why even the quiet ones stay quiet, this is why. It's not that they don't see what's happening. It's that they can't afford to. If they validate your truth, they'll have to question the foundation they're standing on. And for many people, it's safer to bury you than unearth that. This is the moment individuation becomes exile, because when you no longer serve the collective narrative, you're cast as the villain to maintain the illusion of peace. You're the chaos. You're the reason things fell apart. But the truth is, things were already falling. You just stopped holding them up. And now that you've left the role they assigned you, they have to create a new one for you. One that explains why they're still stuck, and you had the audacity to walk away. That role is the villain, the ungrateful one, the selfish one, the liar, the traitor. And the most chilling part? That story, the one that paints you as dangerous, isn't just believed by others. It's rehearsed, passed around, repeated until it becomes more real than anything you ever said. And if you don't fight it, if you stay silent, they say you're guilty. If you defend yourself, they say you're unstable. It's a no-win script, because it was never designed for truth. It was designed to protect the illusion. But here's the part they never expect. Even when the whole system turns against you, even when they strip you of the role you once played, there's a kind of power in the rejection. A new kind of truth takes form in the silence they forced you into. A truth they can't unhear, even if they pretend they never heard it. And that is what scares them most. Because your exit didn't just break a rule, it broke a pattern. And if you broke it, maybe others will too. You became a symbol of possibility. Not because you fought them, but because you left. And the story can't survive that. So now they have to discredit you, not just to others, but to themselves. To erase their own guilt. To restore the myth that they were always right, and you were always wrong. But what happens when that rewriting starts to fail? When the mask slips, and the story they're telling no longer fits the person they've become? That's what we're going into next. Stay with me, because we reveal what happens when they start to fracture. The moment you walked away, something broke. Not in you, but in the story they had always told about you. And here's where it shifts. This isn't about disappointment. It's about disruption. A fracture in the symbolic architecture that held their identity together. You weren't just part of the story. You were the counterbalance, the foil, the flaw, the one they could always point to and say, "See? I'm the good one. I'm the strong one. I'm the sane one." But when you stopped playing the role, when you became unrecognizable to the version they constructed, you didn't just become confusing, you became threatening. Because your growth didn't just expose their stagnation, it destabilized the entire narrative equilibrium they'd built to feel safe. In family systems theory, there's a concept called homeostasis, the tendency of a group to maintain emotional balance by assigning fixed roles. You weren't just the scapegoat. You were the emotional pressure valve, the externalized problem that made everyone else feel internally consistent. So what happens when the scapegoat evolves? The entire system panics. It has to reassert control, not by returning to the truth, but by doubling down on the myth. They need the story more than they need the relationship, because the story protects the ego. The story absolves them. The story keeps the illusion intact. Enter René Girard's mimetic scapegoat mechanism. In a group, whether a family, community, or digital mob, when tensions rise and blame needs a home, the collective unconsciously selects a person to carry the burden of their unspoken conflict. The scapegoat isn't chosen because they're weak. They're chosen because they're visible, accessible, and different enough to make disowning the truth feel justified. Your refusal to carry the projection anymore forced them to scramble for a new narrative. So they rewrote you, not based on who you are, but based on what they needed you to never become. Self-possessed, non-compliant, free. That was never part of the script. So now the logic warps. Suddenly, you're arrogant, you're unstable, you're dangerous. The better you get, the worse they must make you seem, because otherwise they'd have to question why they needed you broken. And it runs deeper still. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, every self is organized around a lack, a sense of incompleteness projected outward onto others. When someone plays a fixed role in your story, you're not just relating to them. You're using them to stabilize your own identity. But when that person changes, when they withdraw or transform or stop complying, your coordinates collapse. The other becomes unpredictable, and that's terrifying. Not because it's immoral, but because it forces a confrontation with your own emptiness. Nietzsche warned us about this reversal in Beyond Good and Evil. He said, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster." But in fragile systems, that's exactly what happens. You stop fighting, you walk away, and suddenly, you become the monster. Why? Because you refused to mirror the script back to them. Because you became proof that obedience was never necessary, that peace was possible outside the system, that healing didn't require permission. And nothing is more dangerous to a system built on silence, shame, and control than someone who rises without it. So now they have to discredit you, not to hurt you, but to preserve themselves. Because if the myth cracks, they'll have to reckon with everything they exiled into you. And most people would rather live inside a lie than confront what they've buried. But here's where it gets darker, because once the story starts unraveling, their desperation doesn't fade. It festers. They'll try to control the narrative any way they can. Guilt, manipulation, even sabotage. Because the truth doesn't just threaten their image. It threatens their entire psychological foundation. And when the myth can no longer contain the truth, The war begins. Stay close, because we're about to expose exactly how far people will go to keep you cast in a role you never chose. They didn't just cast you as the villain to save face, they did it to save the entire structure. Because once the script begins to crack, so does the system that depends on it. And here's what most people don't understand. The story wasn't just something they told about you, it was the scaffolding of their identity. A fragile construction held together by compliance, consensus, and control. You weren't just rejecting a role, you were rejecting their reality. And when you walked away from the performance, you didn't just abandon the narrative. You exposed the fact that it was a performance all along. In that moment, everything they had buried beneath the surface, the lies, the projections, the moral disguises, all of it started to rise. Because the mask only works if everyone agrees to keep it on. And you stopped agreeing. That's when the collapse begins. Not with screaming, not with some dramatic rupture, but with a quiet unraveling. A narrative that once made sense suddenly doesn't. They start forgetting their lines, their self-justifications grow sloppy, their righteousness begins to rot. Because you've shown what they were never supposed to see. That the truth doesn't destroy you, it frees you. That survival is possible without submission. That love without control is real, and they never had it. That someone can walk away and become more whole, not less. And that truth, it doesn't just threaten the story, it threatens the system that needs the story to survive. The family system, the friend group, the cultural order, the algorithm. In every case, the moment one person steps out of the delusion, it forces a reckoning for everyone still inside. And now, their world starts to turn against itself. Because when the designated scapegoat refuses the role, the need for a villain doesn't disappear. It mutates. They turn on each other. The moral purity they used as armor turns brittle. And all the illusions they weaponized begin to collapse under their own weight. This is what Girard called mimetic contagion. When blame spreads like a virus, when conflict can no longer be outsourced to a single, silent target, when the sacred narrative unravels and the tribe turns inward. But don't romanticize this collapse, because they won't go quietly. The death of a lie doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings backlash, because control wasn't just a strategy, it was their oxygen. And when you take it away, they suffocate. They lash out. Not because you harmed them, but because you lived. You became proof of life beyond their limits, and that is intolerable to a psyche still dependent on illusion. They don't want freedom. They want familiarity, even if that familiarity is built on suffering, repression, and denial. And now that you've left the script, you are no longer a person to them. You are a threat, because your very existence calls into question their entire foundation. The role they were given, the stories they were told, the lies they told themselves to survive. It's all under threat, because you stopped pretending. So don't be surprised when the collapse brings chaos. This is not just psychological recoil, it's existential panic. Because if you were never what they said you were, then what does that make them? And if the story was false, then what does that say about everyone who enforced it? This is where things fracture, not just for them, but for you too. Because in the ashes of their old narrative, you'll be forced to face a new question. If I'm not who they said I was, then who am I? And that is where we're going next. We're going to walk through the void left behind when the performance ends, and no one is clapping anymore. What no one tells you is this. After the story collapses, after the roles shatter and the illusion burns out, what's left isn't freedom. It's silence. And not the peaceful kind. It's the silence of identity disintegration. Because when the lie dies, something else does too. The person who believed it. See, the narrative wasn't just a prison. It was also a structure, a framework that shaped their decisions, defined their worth, and organized their chaos into coherence. It gave them a script to perform, a name to answer to, a villain to point to. And once that collapses, they're not just left without a story. They're left without a self. This is the real terror. They can no longer pretend. But they also don't know who to be without pretending. The ego isn't built for this. It survives by clinging to structure, even if that structure is abusive, distorted, or delusional. And once the scaffolding of projection collapses, they fall into what Lacan calls the lack, a bottomless absence where the imaginary self used to be. This is when the panic begins. Not the performative kind, the existential kind. Because now, they've lost their illusion of moral superiority. They've lost their justification. They've lost the ability to say, I was right to treat them that way. They deserved it. And with that gone, they're naked in the ruins. They're not just ashamed. They're undefined. But here's what makes it even darker. They don't blame the story. They blame you. Because you didn't collapse. You escaped. And that, in their fragmented mind, isn't resilience. It's betrayal. Because your survival without them forces a horrifying possibility. That none of it was necessary. That the narrative wasn't true. That their control wasn't protection. It was manipulation. That they weren't the victim. They were the enforcer. And that breaks something. This is where we see the shift. From narrative collapse to identity fracture. From control to chaos. From ego to abyss. And in this moment, you become the mirror they cannot tolerate. Because every time they see you, they don't just see you. They see the version of themselves they can no longer justify. The one who lied. The one who punished. The one who performed. The one who lost control. This is why so many people don't heal. They rebuild the illusion faster than it can fall apart. They construct a new story, one where you were the manipulator, one where your silence was cruelty, where your absence was abandonment, where your strength was violence. Because that's easier than facing the truth, that they were never the hero, and you were never the villain. You were just the first one willing to walk away from the script. Philosophers like Camus wrote that when the absurd becomes visible, when the myth collapses, you're left with a decision. Cling to delusion, or endure the void. Most people? They cling, because it's not the pain of the truth that breaks them. It's the emptiness that follows, and so they reconstruct fast. They gather new followers, find new scapegoats, build new myths. Because the alternative, to sit in the silence, to confront the self beneath the story, feels like death. And for the ego, it is. But here's the part no one warns you about. This same collapse. It can happen to you too. When you stop playing the role they gave you, you don't just lose their illusion. You start to lose your own. The one that said, if I'm good enough, they'll stop hurting me. The one that said, if I stay small, they'll feel safe. The one that believed silence meant peace, and compliance meant love. And when that collapses, it's not just liberating, it's destabilizing. Because even though it was killing you, it was also holding your identity together. This is the psychological double collapse. You escape the role, and then you have to survive what's left when the role disappears. No applause, no clarity, no safety net. Just you. And that's the turning point. Because some people rebuild themselves from the rubble, and some people just try to bury you in it. So what do you do now, when the story has died, when the performance has ended, when both of you are standing in the aftermath, one scrambling for another illusion, the other holding nothing but the truth? That's where we go next, because the final act isn't revenge, it's revelation. Let's go there. You were never meant to become the villain. But the moment you disobeyed the script, the one they built to preserve their identity, you became too unpredictable to control, too honest to excuse, too real to forgive. And the paradox is this: the more you step into truth, the more you expose the lie they still need to survive. That's why they need you to be wrong. That's why they rewrite you in their mind, not as the one who escaped, but as the one who betrayed them. Not because you were cruel, but because you were proof. Proof that freedom was always possible, and that illusion was always a choice. This is where Nietzsche's shadow steps in. He said, "Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed." And that's what you are now. Not a person, a rupture, a living threat to the delusion they've rebuilt. You don't belong in their narrative anymore, because you dismantled it. And the truth is, you were never supposed to. So what do you do now? You don't go back. You don't explain. You don't become the villain they're trying to provoke. You become something far more dangerous. The one who sees, not just them, but the structure. Not just the pain, but the pattern. You don't speak to be understood. You speak to be heard by those still trapped inside the myth, and those who are ready to leave it behind. Because someone out there has been cast as the scapegoat their whole life. Always too much, always not enough, always rewritten, recast, reduced, so someone else could feel righteous. If that's you, this is your sign to stop apologizing. They didn't exile you because you were broken. They exiled you because you wouldn't be. And that makes you unforgettable. If you've ever been turned into the villain for telling the truth, drop a "no more lies" in the comments. Let the others know they're not alone. There comes a time when you stop begging to be understood and start becoming the kind of truth that can't be denied. You don't obey the story. You end it. And in doing so, you free not just yourself, but everyone still trapped inside. Because when one person refuses the script, the entire illusion begins to burn. And from the ashes, something real can finally begin.